level, how do you be thoughtful about how you design your organization? We're joined today by our great featured guest, Heidi Gibson. Heidi, welcome. How are you?
I'm awesome. I will admit that I'm still waking up a little bit, but
That's totally
doing well.
fair.
I'm very excited to share my learnings today.
Awesome. Great. We're really excited to have you. If you could tell folks maybe like 60 seconds about some of your recent product experience, that would be great.
Sure. I recently joined Adobe about a month ago, where I am actually embarking on this exact exercise again. So all of this is relevant for me. I'm leading product-led growth, which is really a new discipline there, sitting between marketing and product. And so right in the mix of it. And that's for the Document Cloud business, which is a $5 billion business, which is kind of exciting. 40 years old and figuring out how to disrupt ourselves. I spent a year at Typeform, which is based in Barcelona. So I got to travel to Barcelona once a quarter, running core product over there. And that's what we'll be talking about today. I spent 5 years at GoDaddy before that, where I really pioneered growth teams, product growth teams. I can see some folks I worked with there here. Hello. So I'm looking forward to getting heckled by the people that know me. Please do so. And I've overall been doing product for 20 odd years. I took 5 years off to open a small local restaurant chain and become a chef. So I have an alter ego, which is the commander-in-chief of the American Grilled Cheese Kitchen. So if anyone has questions about grilled cheese, I'm here for you.
Okay, so we have some Q&A topics just to precede: grilled cheeses and melts, Barcelona tips. So like we could definitely start a thread on everyone's top recommendations in Barcelona, just to give some ideas to folks here. So that's awesome. Thank you so much for that intro. Let's talk today about your time at Typeform. So we're going to talk through one long case study, but it's kind of broken into these two subparts. First, talking about organizational design, then to kind of talking about owners versus facilitators. Again, these are kind of to the room. These are two of the highlights of the module content. The goal of today is to kind of highlight one or two concepts. It's not a review of the content. That takes time that you need to kind of time block on your calendar app of choice. So for us, it's to how do we illustrate this, bring it to life, show it in the real world, and how it happened in this case at Typeform. So with that, let's dive in and talk organizational design at Typeform. Heidi, tell us a little bit about kind of Typeform as a business. Maybe people might be familiar with it, potentially just as consumers. Tell us a little bit more about the company and what it was like when you joined.
Yeah, for those that aren't familiar with Typeform, you probably have filled out a Typeform at some point. A decent portion of the population has. Typeform is pretty straightforward. It's a form building tool, so it's pretty horizontal in application. Primarily used by small businesses. It's very easy to use, no code, super simple way to build a form. Forms are used for market research, feedback, lead generation, a whole number of different things, but primarily B2B. And it's a 12-year-old company, was about 300 people when I joined, running about 65 million ARR. And the goal was, let's go big. So really looking to expand and grow rapidly. It's as I said, a fairly mature product that had product market fit, but in this kind of specific niche. The product team was mostly in Europe, but some in US. I'm based in the US. So we had, during the pandemic, there'd been a big shift from Europe only to now across US and Europe, and increasingly into other geos as well.
Interesting. So you have kind of like a company that had some existing kind of growth and we really wanted to amp it up ahead of an IPO.
Yep. And had grown very organically before that.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting inflection point that a lot of companies see, where they have had not accidental success, but like a little less systemic in their approach, and they've had some great success to date. Here, about $65 million in ARR. And then they said, okay, now we need to kind of like systematize this, figure out what's working, figure out what's not, so that we can more easily accelerate to a higher milestone. And that's kind of where you came in, and you kind of diagnosed kind of what you saw was going on. Tell us about kind of what you found the product org to be. I kind of titled this, the product org was maybe a little disorg. What did you see there? And what was interesting there?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about the product org. First, I actually want to make a comment about product strategy, because something I've learned the hard way is you need to understand your product strategy and what it is you're trying to do before you get into designing an organization to deliver that strategy. And when you're working through your organization, that's a North Star to keep coming back to is what's the strategy, what are the priorities, what is it we want to do, get done in the next year? And that will help you kind of make decisions and trade-offs and things along the way, which you will have to make. So I was simultaneously kind of assessing the product org, which had some tactical issues, which I very quickly heard about from everyone, and also assessing the state of the product strategy. So we had these very ambitious goals, as I mentioned, to accelerate our growth. And what I wasn't clear on when I first joined is, can we just do more of what we're doing better, or do we really need to do something else, right? Is that going to take us to where we need to go? And do we understand what's going to take us to where we need to go? And so I kind of did those two things in parallel. But the basic state of the product organization, around 15 PMs, I found that it was very layered. So we had situations where there was, one kind of junior PM reporting to a senior PM, reporting to a group PM, reporting to a director, reporting to me, reporting to a CPO. We had a CPO who had joined just a couple months before I did. I actually followed her over from GoDaddy, Irana Wasti, for those of you who know her. I know there's a few who do. And so she had a much larger remit than just the product org. So she was running performance marketing and support and a whole number of areas. So she brought me in to focus specifically on the product org. And she had a number of other people kind of working across all of it. We were also doing fundraising in the middle of this, so that was taking up a lot of her time.
Busy. Yeah.
So she was, involved, but somewhat tangentially, just to mention. So those layers were one issue that I noticed right away. And my concern there was we had these little silos of people and a lot of kind of overlap and management layers. Everyone wanted to be a manager. And when I started poking on, okay, why does everyone want to be a manager? It's because they believe that that's how they would get a promotion. So another issue was, okay, we need to reset expectations around how you get a promotion. We need to make sure that everyone's got a path to growth, and that is whether or not you become a manager, right? Yeah. When I polled the team, and so I went and interviewed all the product managers in the company, not all of whom reported to me. So I went and talked to everyone and what do you think our strategy is? What's working? What's not, right? And just start getting an idea. I heard very different ideas of what the strategy was. Mostly I heard, I don't know what it is. Teams were very autonomous. So engineering in particular had prized autonomy over outcomes or anything else. And when I asked what's the most important thing, it was that we can act autonomously. And I think that was probably an overcorrection from some earlier issues.
Yeah, we can certainly go back to that previous slide in a second if you'd like, but I just wanted to kind of focus on the slide as you're talking about some of the challenges that you were seeing, especially around autonomy being a major import without necessarily alignment on goals. You want to talk more on this kind of like some of the strategic gaps that you were seeing?
Yeah, that autonomy and all of this is a balance, as I'm sure all of you know, where you want enough autonomy that you can get things done, but you all need to be pulling in the same direction. So what I have found is that the sort of overall strategy and goals, that really needs to be top down. So there needs to be a product vision and an overarching product strategy, and that needs to be clear to everyone. And it's the responsibility of the product leaders to deliver that and to make sure everyone understands it. And if you're sitting in a role where you don't know what that is, agitate, don't take, I don't know for an answer, or maybe this is an opportunity for you to figure out the strategy. But making sure that it's communicated over and over and over and over to everybody, to the product teams and engineering and design. So everyone needs to understand. You'll feel like you're repeating it ad nauseum. Repeat it 20 more times. Additionally, the what I found at Typeform was this very sort of beautiful, sort of ambiguous vision that hadn't been translated into an actual strategy. What are we going to do in the next year? What are the 3 most important things to do in the next year was really unclear. And each of the individual sort of feature areas, which they were organized into, each had their own set of priorities and their own audience, and were sort of tripping over each other. And there was no kind of universal coordination.
So it sounded like there was like this. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, and there were some other areas with no coverage, no product manager coverage, which we'll talk about a little bit more too.
For sure. So just to put a finer point on something you just said, product vision and an overarching strategy is critical, and that Typeform seemed to have this lofty vision statement that didn't necessarily connect or guide enough the product and engineering teams, who felt like they were really autonomous and they love the autonomy, but not necessarily knew where they were going.
Yeah, quickly going in little circles. We're off in different directions.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes.
We hit on a couple topics here already, like especially the layers where kind of like people management was conflated with success, which is like a really important thing to unpack. And then, you mentioned that the team was kind of siloed. Sometimes stuff was not staffed at all. So it was like important, but not important enough. It was noted as important, but not important enough to put people on it. And then you had a couple separate product teams. You mentioned in the intro, but so you were kind of talking core product here, and you had peers around growth and long-term bets. Can you tell us a second about that?
Yeah. So when I joined, there was already a peer who was running a growth team, product growth team. And for me, that was, I'll say, a little awkward because I'd spent 5 years running growth teams, and I was like, but wait, what? So it took some negotiation to kind of figure out how those teams work together. We'll talk more about that, but they already had, they were much smaller than the core growth team or core product team, pardon me. So core product had all the sort of feature crews running the core product. There was this new growth team that was already in place that was looking at acquisition, conversion, monetization, retention, kind of classic growth categories, but very small team and very new. And they were kind of struggling with how to get things done across these product surface areas that were owned by these other teams. So they had challenges too with being effective. And then the company had already peeled out what we called horizons. So some companies do this, where there were longer term bets. I'd mentioned at the outset, we weren't sure if continuing to do what we were doing was going to get us there or not. In fact, we kind of knew it wouldn't, right? We couldn't grow what we had fast enough to do what we wanted. So there were a couple sort of investment areas. Those had been peeled out of the core product team and were resourced and staffed completely separately. And there was like pretty much a wall between those teams. And that had been done purposely so that those teams could iterate on their own, wouldn't have the financial pressure of delivering results. So my core team kind of carried with the growth team carried 90% of the revenue growth goals, to give them freedom and not have competing resources. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, because there were parts of that worked and parts of that that didn't. And then last point here was platform. So we had these platform technology teams that were in the CTO org, engineering org, but there were no technical product managers. There were no product managers kind of in there at all running platform. And that caused issues primarily around sort of coordination and prioritization. So the reality was then all of these autonomous product teams were going to the platform teams, which of course they had a ton of dependencies on, and lobbying for their case. And the platform teams had kind of no ability to prioritize or negotiate all these incoming requests. So they would just do what they thought was the most important thing, which had no relation to the actual product strategy. So that was one last bit of fun.
Bit of challenge here. Yeah. And so you mentioned this a second, or we talked about this, but a little unclearly. I didn't clarify what it meant, but zero staff objectives means like these were things that the company said were important, but yet did not have a product manager or engineers on it, or what was the nuance stated here by the company?
It was I mean, the company, partially there was this sort of company strategy of who's responsible for, let's say, figuring out this long-term vision, right? So we had these horizons that were focused on these specific, very specific sort of feature areas. They had no understanding of kind of the core business, somewhat on purpose. But how would we get from sort of here to there? Like, we had this core business, we had these features we were sort of resourcing. There was no clear path from here to there, and it wasn't at all clear who would figure that out, right? So like my job ostensibly was like delivering the, you know, the in-year revenue with core and the sort of adjacent growth. These other teams, which I had really nothing to do with, were sort of working on the future, and how all this was supposed to come together was just.
And then the gaps that you mentioned were like the zero step objectives, where it's just like there's outcomes that we want to drive, but no one is kind of working towards those with any sort of feature or other kind of effort.
Yes.
Got it. Okay, cool. Awesome. So this is, I think, a lot of interesting kind of existing organizational structure here, especially around like long-term bets. I think that could be a good area for us to kind of get into in Q&A, excuse me, with like innovation teams that a lot of companies form, and what makes that potentially successful or potentially, you know, unsuccessful. So I think that could be a very interesting part of what we talk about. So we kind of talked about some of the pain points here. Let's now move to kind of what you identified in making this run a little bit more smoothly and like be a little bit more strategic. Tell us about how you set, like what strategy you set.
Yeah. So I'll stress here that this was not a simple exercise, and it's not like I came in and a week later was like, here's our new product strategy, everybody, and everyone got on board. Like, life doesn't work that way. I mentioned I sort of had these two parallel activities. There were actually 3 or 4 parallel activities at the same time, because we were trying to deliver the in-quarter results as well, and we had work going on. And we had, of course, great resignation, people leaving, people joining, recruiting. So there was a lot going on at the same time. But the org design and figuring out the strategy, and this was all a product strategy across all of it, I kind of did in parallel. And one thing that was sort of important for me was I kind of ignored the boundaries of what my job was. So, that often works out for you. I was sort of hired to run core product, but when I came in, what I realized was, okay, yeah, we've got core, but everything needs to be done in the context of the whole product strategy. And there's these other organizations, growth, horizons, and there was actually even one more team, this website team also had some product management in here, that were operating totally independently, and that we really needed to bring those things together. So part of what I needed to do was sort of recruit my peers in those other areas to join me on this venture of coming up with one strategy that spanned us all. Yeah, which we had a lot of different stakeholders, selling that to the executives and to the teams, and across us, really understanding what the goals were and what sort of levers we had. So a few specific things in here. I'm not going to talk about everything, I promise.
Sure. Yeah.
But a few specific things in here that ended up really impacting org design. Partnerships and business development was early on, we realized an opportunity for us. So this is true in so many companies like this, where the ecosystem that your product is operating in, right? So we're building forms. Well, where are those forms going? And what do they need to do, right? Embedding those forms in a website turned out to be really valuable activity, or embedding them in social media. So embedding the published forms somewhere became partnership opportunities. Also, working with companies like doing integrations, data integrations. So the point of a form is not the form. The point of the form is the data that you get out of the form. And getting that data to the people that are going to use it, or into some systems that do something with it, is more valuable than just having it dumped into a file somewhere. So data integrations and functional integrations and traffic partnerships we realized a huge untapped opportunity for Typeform. And with that strategy, like sort of overall company strategy, there was a brand new VP of business development who had been brought in and had a small team, and they were tasked with building a strategy around these partnerships, and actually reaching out to other technology companies and, sort of doing deals to help us get more traffic and things like this. So they were really driving that part of the strategy, but my product teams really owned the execution, all of that. So that was like a particular area that was interesting. We also needed to have just an all-up understanding of how our metrics worked and what metrics were mattered. So we had an activity going on with this peer who was head of growth and the analytics team to create a metrics framework. And the way I like to think of this is you've got your outcome metrics, which might be ARR, retention rates. You've got those outcomes, and then you need to work back up your driver tree to figure out what sort of in-product driver metrics you have that actually correlate and drive those outcomes. And those are the things you need to have for your product teams rather than those outcomes. Like, it's not fair to give a product team, your goal is to deliver ARR.
Can't be driving revenue. I have to have those leading indicators. Absolutely.
Yeah, but you can give a team like, okay, your job is driving integration, adoption, usage, and we know that that's going to ladder up.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yep.
And then like also just like the narrowing the focus to 12 months was helpful here in that like it's no longer this like 5-year vision of build the future, but like here's how we get there. So what was like the artifact you created to help focus to 12 months? Like what did that mean?
Yeah, really a roadmap, high level product roadmap and outcomes, and a list of what we're not going to do in the next 12 months. Equally important. A couple little tricks I've developed over time to kind of get people on board who have different agendas on board with this is, sometimes they're like, but what about, right? And and you can help guide people with like, okay, but what are we going to do in the next quarter? Okay, what are we not going to do in the next quarter? And if something that we think might be important actually, gets importance, and we decide, oh my gosh, it's more important to do that in the next quarter than next year, fine, we can pull it in and reprioritize, but always having an idea of like what's next, and next doesn't mean never, right? So it's not, we're not going to do that. It's just, no, we're not doing that next. Right. We're going to do that later. And having a process to build confidence with people that you are kind of reprioritizing and they have a voice and they have input is important too. So having a transparent planning process with your stakeholders where they have an opportunity to give input will build confidence that they don't just get sort of lost in the shuffle. Yeah.
And then the last point here, just on that, you were making a reorg, or you were kind of in charge of reorg, and I think it's fair to say like no reorg will ever be the last one, right? Like I think there's probably a good cadence that they shouldn't be happening every 6 months, major ones. But it's just good to set expectations that like, hey, this makes sense for us now, and maybe for the next year and a half, but maybe not forever, ever. Yeah, and the product team started asking me questions like, so this is the last time, right? Because we're tired of this. And it was like, no, because the organization is going to grow, the strategy is going to change. So if we never change the org, we're just going to keep doing what we're doing, right? The org is the mission of this organization is to execute our strategy. And if the strategy never changes, okay, then the org doesn't have to change. But our strategy is going to change every year, right? This is tech. This is what we signed up for. Yeah. So speaking of kind of like the org and what it looked like, briefly, just because I know we're running a little bit behind, tell us about kind of where there were horizontal groups versus what was verticals here. Yeah. So I mentioned there was this sort of website team that was really responsible for like traffic acquisition, sign up, right? It was a marketing site. But they had some parts of kind of what I think of growth products, subscriptions and plans, and sign up and conversion. And another helpful exercise when you're sort of thinking about like, okay, what are my options, is to take a customer journey lens through your organization. And okay, the common customer journey, what organizations are owning the different steps of that along the way? And in this case,
the customer journey, the user was going sort of back. There was just handoffs through the whole thing across different product orgs, which caused a lot of friction, and we would sort of drop things in between. So the issues were not only sort of discontinuous user experience, some slowness, but also missed opportunities kind of at the interstices between those steps, right? So one team would throw them over the wall and, and hope something good happened. I've mentioned that growth tribe. I mentioned platform, which is a product, but a somewhat unique one in my opinion. Yeah. And then we had within core product, really builder results and ecosystems, which own these integrations and partnerships, and also had this odd assortment of sort of developer tools and SDKs and things. And then horizons. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about those horizons, I think, as we go along.
I think that makes sense. Yeah, like I think that what you showed here, where you had some kind of full horizontal ones, where some like features like own a specific feature area, like the builder and the results experience, and building in ecosystems integrations. It's interesting to see here what was like strictly defined as the feature versus what was kind of like more overarching or vague, and we'll see kind of how this evolved. So just to take a step back for the room, everyone's kind of gone through the module, so I won't spend much time here, but overall, we're looking to drive this combination of accountability and collaboration. And there's this kind of like this tension between the two about how you drive kind of clear accountability of who's doing what and how you get teams to work together to drive collaboration. There's a couple of ways to solve this, especially in product teams, to kind of shift more feature-based and direct about what you own in features, or more outcome-based about, hey, here's the goal, go get to it. Both are valid. Believe me, neither is perfect. Each comes with a set of trade-offs. As at a high level on the features teams, the trade-offs here is they need to define what's important to the business. And like, otherwise you're just building features for feature's sake, and you're not actually moving the needle or measuring where this needle is. And then outcome teams, it needs to be specific enough and not be too vague or open-ended, so that you don't know kind of like, is this outcome, how do we actually move this outcome, and what does this team build towards that? So the pitfalls, as we cover in the module, like feature teams, you have to map the features to the right outcomes, as I said, and they're hard to evaluate because like, if I have a team that's driving kind of my account and profile, and they did a great job this year, but like making my profile page isn't really the best thing for my product right now, how do I judge their success if they didn't have like the maximal impact? And then similarly on outcome teams, like the opposite. Now, like if you have too high of an outcome, too vague of one, like as Heidi mentioned, ARR, of course, is the overarching one, is obviously too lagging and too broad. But even retention, is that specific enough for a team, or do you need to go even more specific? And then a second pitfall here is that these maintenance tasks can fall between the cracks. When you have outcome teams that are all going on like the number one thing, you might have these kind of hidden detractors of things that need maintenance, that need improvement, that no one owns because it's not someone's pet project or the top three, priorities. They don't get attention. So some pitfalls to think of on either side of here, very briefly. Obviously, the content goes much deeper and much more thoughtfully through this content for you to definitely go through. So with that said, of kind of what we know about feature and outcome-based teams, what Heidi's told you about kind of like the experience for customers and for the business at Typeform, which way would you go here? Would you go more of a feature-based team approach or an outcome-based team approach? Tell us a little bit more in the thread about your rationale, kind of like how you would organize the team and why. So I think there's a good clarifying question here, and Heidi, like maybe you can answer this in a second on a goal for a feature-based org, what that would look like. But for other Q&A, we're going to get to Q&A in about half an hour. And submitting your question then is actually most beneficial to you. It will get the most upvotes and will actually get answered. So like I encourage you to ask those types of questions in about half an hour. But to clarify on like kind of a feature-based org, Heidi, what would that potentially look like? You had some feature-based orgs kind of coming into this at Typeform. What did that look like?
Feature-based, so Typeform, the Typeform sort of core product experience, as I mentioned, it's a form builder, and and there's a couple core features that you really can't get around, right? That are absolutely must-haves for, to be able to build a form and get results. So form builder being one, right? You can't have a form without a form builder, and someone
And then
will
what's the
always
goal for
need
them?
to, that is durable, right? So there's some features in there that are durable and have must work, and you're kind of never done. The form builder team is one. Results is another one. So a results area where the customer can access those results, do something with those results. So those were core feature areas that are just must-haves, and also areas that we get sort of the most customer feedback, requests. If you ask the customer, like, what is this product comprised of, they're going to mention those two things.
Can you give an example of, like, let's say the builder here, like what would be a great goal for that, which existed as a feature-based team?
Yeah. I did go through this exercise of kind of mapping, trying to figure out, like, okay, the builder, like, how do we measure success? And it's a little bit indirect, a couple things. One was activation. So we defined activation at Typeform as meaning that the customer had published a form and gotten 5 responses. So there's a setup of just building a form. Publishing that form and actually getting responses means, like, the customer has gotten some value out of the product, right? So for that builder team, we made activation the kind of their primary outcome. And they had more responsibility than that, right? Because people come back and build multiple forms. They might go change forms, like, there's a lot more they do. But that sort of initial form success was the most critical thing.
Got it. I think it's good. It's good to know that, like, when people think feature teams, they think they might not have any kind of guidance on what their goal state is, what their outcome is. So it's good to know that, like, for example, the builder team was kind of mainly judged here on how do we drive something just outside the build, right? The activation of, like, actually getting results. That's an interesting take. And I think net a positive one. So here, in the poll, we have a strongly weighted to outcomes response, 30-4. So a bunch of I think product leaders that have, like, tattoos that says, like, outcomes over outputs, which I agree, obviously, but in this case, like, I think it's interesting to think about where a team can be actually most empowered as a feature-based team versus outcome. I'm trying I'm reading through the responses, and I think there's a lot of good ones saying, like, the features are important, but, like, outcomes is what's going to kind of move us forward. So I'm reading a lot of things to that point, and that outcomes as product market fit is fairly clear. So it's just like, we know what features to build, so now let's go figure out how to maximize outcomes. Let's talk, Heidi, about your approach. I think you kind of had a bit of a hybrid approach here. Tell us a little bit more about what you wrestled with in making this decision.
Yeah, I will say my answer was yes. And partially it was, I've mentioned the situation when I joined where we had these new growth teams, we had these horizon teams, right? And my job was, ostensibly primarily core, but I realized I had to design core and the whole organization kind of together to make sense. And core product, I chose to keep as feature-based because, and I was sort of alluding to this, there were a couple core feature areas that were simply fundamental product value. There is no product without those things. And then within those things, we had in our metrics exercise, we had identified a few driver metrics that were good levers for those feature teams to focus on. And those were things that might change over time. For instance, form builder. So long as we are a form building company, we're going to have a form builder of some kind, but what's in there could change over time. And we had found that logic and personalization within the form builder, if customers use logic, which might be calculations or things like that, or personalization, they could pull in data from a CRM or something like that to be able to personalize the experience or ask for a name up front and then use that data later in the form, right? So if they use those kinds of tools, they were much more likely to retain. And I'll say at the outset too, like, retention was our big challenge. We did an analysis and it was like retention was really it. So they had a couple of very clear levers. within the builder team of drive adoption and usage of personalization. We had a couple strong hypotheses of additional kind of feature usage that we were pretty sure would drive retention. A couple new things. One was branding, that if the customer, we could get the customer to add their logo and branding to the forms, they were more likely to retain. I learned that one at GoDaddy. So they had a couple really clear levers to pull that laddered very directly up to those outcome metrics that we cared about. So we kept them feature based, but their mission was very much about moving these downstream metrics. We also already had these growth teams that were already outcome based. And so we kept that, and we ended up with a little bit of a matrix where we had the feature crews clearly responsible for quality, bugs, user experience, right, within those features. That was a big differentiator for us. And we also had these horizontal teams. So one big issue one big change was, okay, we realized, I realized those growth teams weren't really working with the product teams at all. So,
yeah.
And they were having sort of limited impact because their big frustration was, hey, I want to be able to do more, but the feature teams own these surfaces and I can't really get stuff done in those surfaces. And right. So how do we get these teams to work together more effectively and collaborate to a greater end? How do we empower the growth teams without taking away responsibility for outcomes from feature crews? It was hard and it's tricky. And I'll say there's no one right answer. And this is one where, the people on the ground end up sort of impacting some of the decisions you make here too, because you need people who are willing to get on board.
Totally. I encourage someone, I actually let me just ask to the room, someone should submit a question at the top of Q&A about like, what are some of the best practices on feature, like regular core product teams and growth teams, and how do they best work together? And what are some of the pitfalls to avoid? I think that would be a great topic for Q&A. So I think this totally makes sense around kind of making some sort of hybrid approach, kind of this feature-based teams for architectural oversight, technical oversight, but having them be smart about where they're headed, especially for a product that has such a clear customer journey through discrete product surfaces, building something, soliciting responses, evaluating responses, distributing and integrating. So like it kind of had made sense that it had some feature set, kind of feature breakup. So as a reminder, this is kind of the original Typeform product org. I know there's a lot on this slide. We're not kind of going through that. Just wanted to give as context here. In the change here, can you just focus a little bit on kind of how you enabled the platform team and maybe one or two changes you made in these verticals?
Yeah. You'll notice it's not that different, right? There's some areas where I made a couple radical changes, some other areas where I didn't make a lot of change. As mentioned, those feature crews, I felt like someone still needs to own those features, and it was largely working, except that they just needed more direction on kind of which direction to row, right? We did move, I got everyone on board with the idea that we needed to have PMs running platform, right? And that we'd all have better outcomes and better visibility if we did. So we ended up moving some of the people and responsibilities out of that website, that sort of marketing website team, and into platform. There was already a fairly senior level person who was sort of like shadow playing a platform PM role. Yeah. And she really wanted to be a platform PM. That was her DNA. So we moved her into the engineering team, and she was the lead platform PM. And that meant taking some of the responsibilities with her as well. So that was a change. I moved a couple features around. So I've mentioned how the builder tribe, their primary KPI was activation, right? Customers actually publishing a form and getting 5 results. So they didn't have all the tools they needed to be able to accomplish that. And in my opinion, it's okay for, you never have 100% sort of ability to accomplish everything you want. Like life just doesn't work that way. But I moved some features into that tribe, this logic, the embed and share features, so that they would have more autonomy, and also so they could they could make embedding and sharing just part of the building experience, because we were sort of shipping our org and everybody ships their org. And so what had been happening was embed and share was over in the apps and integrations tribe. And those tribes kind of were not collaborating enough. So we'd build the form and then it was throw it over the wall. And maybe some point later, in the experience, we'd be like, hey, do you want to share that form somewhere? But by bringing that up front, we were better able to sort of integrate that into the form building experience and drive a lot more embedding and sharing behavior.
So you really gave that feature team kind of everything they needed to be successful, even though it's not explicitly building a survey, right? It is that embedding and sharing. It's like they needed that to be successful in their mission.
Right.
And I think that totally makes sense.
Yep. There's no actual point to the survey itself. And
fair.
Yeah. And I repositioned so that apps and integrations tribe, it was ecosystems. I ended up changing the whole mission of that tribe. And this was really as an outcome of two things. One was better understanding that 1 year, that sort of 1 year product priorities and strategy. And also sort of talking to people on the ground and understanding that they felt like they had too many competing priorities and didn't know what their job was. So we decided, okay, in 1 year, our goal is moving retention. That's the most important thing, driving usage of these existing valuable features that we have. So integration adoption was relatively low. And we knew that a lot more customers would benefit from it than we're using it now. I mentioned we had this new partnerships organization that had a charter to go create strategic partnerships and execute them. They had no ability to actually execute that. What they needed was a development team and product crew to be able to partner with to get that work done. So they needed some resources. And this was the obvious place, the obvious sort of group to partner with that new biz dev team. So I changed their mission from your job is to empower developers to be able to build on top of Typeform, which wasn't really happening anyway, to your job is to get as many customers to adopt and use integrations and partnerships as possible. So I made it a customer-focused mission instead of kind of a partner-focused mission, even though with partnerships, right? So at the end of the day, are people using your stuff, right? And success with the integrations is the most important thing.
Yeah, I like that as a goal for them to be much more grounded to what drives to success. There's a question here. Can you just ballpark for us the varying size of these different tribes?
Sure. I'll talk about product managers, I guess, what's in the tribe. There's product managers, obviously engineers, designers, analysts. The builder tribe had 4 product managers and a group PM. I actually pulled the group PM, was one of the product managers, pulled her out and made her the lead. I'll talk a little bit about why on that a little bit. Results tribe had 3 product managers. Our sort of assessment there was, yes, this is an absolutely mission critical part of the product, but not the top priority for the next year. So we actually sort of streamlined there. And that crew was responsible for sort of incremental improvement, but not, revolutionary improvement at this point.
Yeah. And then some just had probably fewer, some probably had like 1 or 2 PMs, right? Like, I guess new, like growing things like you were just mentioning about apps and integrations.
Oh yeah. Apps and integrations went from, I actually reduced the number of people there because I reduced their mission substantially. That was a director and 3 PMs. Okay. And then this enterprise tribe, I ended up sort of dissolving the horizons for various reasons. It just wasn't working. With the things that we had out there, of the 3 things that were there, 2 of them were really things that had to be done in the context of the core product to work. One was enterprise, which really was a plan type and not a different product. So we had been treating it like a different product, but it just didn't really make sense. And also it wasn't really future horizon anymore. Like that was our biggest growth area for the year. So we kind of pulled that in. And workflows was this idea of, hey, can we sort of build more business process workflows on top of the forms to help the customer actually achieve the bigger goal? And that was very still future state, but it had to be done on top of the existing product. And what I realized when I dug in there is they were building this whole parallel world that had nothing to do with the existing product.
Yeah, so I think that kind of gets us a preview into that like innovation team and like where they succeed and where it can be a pitfall. But I want to keep that for a Q&A, I think, because we're only actually about 10 minutes away from there, and we have a mini case ahead of the second part. So just to answer, I think, Hudson's question around like some of these had like 1 or 2 product managers, some had kind of 4 PMs in a group, a GPM. So they kind of varied in size, but none were non-zero. None were 0 staff objectives, which is, I think, the main takeaway here. Mm-hmm. Okay, so now that we've kind of designed the organization at a high level, Heidi's task then kind of was also around thinking like, what kind of product folks are we? There's this matrix here. And again, there's another situation where there's no right answer. I will be brief in the Reforged content here because everyone's kind of reviewed it, but this is just a refresher on thinking about on the vertical axis of this 2x2 outcome-based teams or feature-based teams and what they're accountable for. And then now we're going to talk about the kind of x-axis here on am I an owner and how accountable am I, or am I a facilitator, or as I like to think of them, an orchestra conductor, bringing people together to deliver. So there are different pitfalls to the 2 sides reviewed in the content. So I will leave you to have reviewed that. Now I will turn back to Heidi now to talk about kind of what was it like working together, after this reorg. What did you find in the culture of the team, in how it informs kind of whether we set up as owners or facilitators?
I mentioned a couple things that I thought were important. One is the importance of having some top-down direction in terms of overall strategy and priorities. And I worked with the CPO and C-level to get on board with doing some quarterly direction. So we do a sort of CPO point of view to kick off quarterly planning. Coming out of like pandemic, where any plans you made just got thrown out the window like 2 months later, right? I felt it was important to kind of be nimble and keep our product planning on a quarterly basis so that we could pivot if we needed to, because we didn't really know what the answer was, right, of how to get where we wanted. So we didn't want to.
Were these quarterly OKRs?
Yes. We didn't. Okay. We actually didn't specifically use OKRs, but effectively, yes. Yeah.
Okay. Fair.
So we had an annual plan, which was like improve retention was kind of the highest level sort of annual goal. And then on a quarterly basis, we'd be like, okay, within all the things that we could do in there, where do we want to put the most, where do we want to prioritize? Because we definitely had limited resources, and we had been peanut buttering across and sort of, different areas kind of had the teams they had, and there wasn't this top-down view of like, okay, no, this is the most important thing to do. Let's make sure that everyone's focused on that. And if these other things, fall off, then that's okay. So that was important. Also, to facilitate more collaboration across the teams, we brought in a new quarterly planning process, which was, fairly kind of heavy, where we all get together and everyone would start with what they think they want to do and dependencies and blah, blah, blah. Like you've all been through that, but that was really critical. We also had to bring in, we had to do that together with the growth teams, super important. And we had to do a lot of road showing with all of our stakeholders to get all the stakeholders on board and aware of what we're doing and not doing, and get them bought off on that. Facilitating this partnership between partnerships and biz dev and getting them an execution partner was super important. That took a little bit of effort because that ecosystems team initially felt like they had this slightly different mission. They also initially felt like, hey, my job is driving strategy in this area, and biz dev was like, no, my job is driving strategy in this area, right? So okay, how do we get everyone working together? At
least work together and not be just kind of like 2 simultaneous people thinking of like kind of the same ideas.
Yeah, so that was one we needed to iron out. And additionally, I ended up creating this product ops function. So partially we're in all these different time zones, and we had this history of everyone feeling like they're siloed and doing things in different ways. And we wanted this central visibility. So I had a group PM who sort of was a natural sort of program manager person, who was sort of doing this a little bit behind the scenes anyway, and worked with her to pilot the idea of a product ops function, so we piloted it for a quarter. And she had someone under her who already was looking to move up, and we were confident would be a good group PM. So for a quarter we tried it and everyone loved it, and so we kept it. And I was able to sort of sell it to the organization that way, of having this role that initially they were a little resistant to.
Yeah, that's great. I think I think I'm just going to kind of summarize here that like it sounds like as companies grow and as like product processes get more and more disparate, at some point it makes sense to kind of figure out where to align via product ops, like maybe not 100%, but like 80% alignment on kind of what we do, especially on product processes, like long-term processes, not sprint planning and things like that. And then you kind of highlighted the differences here, some with quarterly planning of like the growth and feature teams, like what are we going to go work on and why, versus the kind of soliciting ideas from the broader ecosystem, the broader world of partnerships and BD, kind of a slightly different approach here. So with that, let's kind of turn to the room to say like, okay, what kind of structure would you bring to this product organization? Would you have product owners, homeowners here as I use it? Would you have facilitators? I believe that's a violin if I'm looking at the bow to instrument size ratio here, not a viola or a cello. And then for other, that one's a really hard one to make an emoji for. So, apologies here, but I use the construction emoji. What would be your approach here? Throw a response and thread on why. And other, I think, will probably be a catch-all also for hybrid approaches here. So tell us what your thoughts. We're going to talk about some of what Heidi concluded and what her approach was and why, and then just kind of talk about some lessons learned here, and then we'll go into Q&A from there. And I see some questions already being dropped in Slack. I know that Slack is not a great tool, so I apologize for always asking you to just wait on submitting those. But I promise you will get more upvotes if you submit your questions during Q&A. So please help me out with that one. Okay, we have owners a little bit in the lead here, but it's not as much of a runaway as outcomes versus features. We have some people thinking about hybrid or other approaches. Ksenia, can you clarify for me what you mean around kind of your hybrid approach here? What is the hybrid nature?
Yeah, for me, I was thinking that like when you're a group PM, you're more need to contact different departments, match different dependencies. And here might be more the facilitator role to keep everything in mind, to think about risks and opportunities. While a PM, when you know your area, you're more an owner here, like you go for it and do it. So this is why I used like hybrid thinking here.
Kind of by seniority. That is interesting. Like I've seen like in company cultures where you have that kind of that facilitator is where facilitator is best. That happens on multiple levels, right? Like the people who have a strong opinion at your GPM counterpart, their subordinates also have strong opinions that your PM is going to end up hearing. And so it's kind of, I will say, like it's a little difficult to have different cultures by seniority, but I think we're gonna see what Heidi did in a second. Thank you for explaining though, and it's getting upvotes. So I wanted to kind of have that as a talk through. My opinion here is not gospel. I could definitely be wrong, but yeah, I've seen kind of a couple different cultures here. We have people voting, some on facilitators, although owners has run away with it a little bit. Not quite 20 to 13. People saying kind of facilitators, team organized and dedicated cross-functional squads. So kind of cross-functional squads with a PM as facilitator, as opposed to like driving it directly as an owner. Okay, cool. I think we have some good takes here, and potentially depending on the tribe, people are saying. So that is interesting. Let's take a look at Heidi's kind of other approach here. Heidi, tell us about kind of what was the key takeaways here.
The answer once again was yes. So I ended up kind of taking this question at a team by team level. So you're all right. I found that those feature teams needed to be owners. They had the best understanding, of their customers, super in the weeds with the customers. Growth, now sort of newly, somewhat more empowered, position both of those sets of teams as owners, whereas this apps integrations team, as I kind of did a lot of hinting here, because of that relationship with BizDev, reposition them really as facilitators. So we clarified the strategy was being driven by that biz dev team, and the PMs in this case really were more facilitators. And platform, of course, were facilitators too. So what had been happening before was the sort of engineering managers were acting as the PMs and they were acting as owners, but they just didn't work, right? So platform, I suspect, often needs to be facilitators in most cases. And then because we had a lot of variability here, this product ops function, again, was really important to sort of surface the issues so that we could shine the light of day on them and get things resolved.
Got it. Awesome. So I think that you have like this interesting hybrid approach when you have certain areas of the company that are more not product driven, specifically around partnerships and BD, right? Where like that needs to be the kind of locus of decision making, and kind of the power decisions are kind of, they shift a little bit outside of product, and the facilitator role worked a little bit better there. And then I get what you're saying on like the owner approach on kind of core feature and growth product work. I think that makes sense. Let's zoom out and just kind of talk about some of the lessons learned. Like, tell us about kind of, we've painted a pretty a brief picture in 45 to 50 minutes. Tell us about some of the complexity here. Like, what were some of the lessons you learned along the way?
Yeah, this was a lot more complicated than this case study sort of implies, just so you're all aware. And as far as like how I actually did this, it took a good 6 months, and there were repeated meetings with everyone along the way, and trying to gather, what do we not want to break that's working, what do we want to fix, and what's the relative priority between those things, where do we have opportunities that we're not addressing, so that's that sort of zero staff opportunities, where do we have blind spots, and also understanding some of the people involved. At the end of the day, you go to war with the army you have and not the army you wish you had. So the actual people, you start slotting them into places, and that might change some of your decisions too, and their skills and weaknesses and hopes and dreams. But a couple of things that were super important: engineering and design, right? So we can design a product org, but if engineering and design don't get on board with that and don't align to that, you're going to have some real problems. So I pulled in my engineering and design partners, counterparts from the beginning, and had them also contribute what's not working, what is working, what do we want to make sure isn't breaking, things like that. And that ended up influencing some of our decisions. And again, so that shared list of problems, I ended up doing a lot of this in Miro, where I would, once a week, we'd get together and we'd sort of update, what are these problems, what are the opportunities, et cetera. And we'd sort of play Jenga until we got it right. You're never going to be done, and it's never going to be perfect. So I had to give up on all kinds of things that I would have liked to do. Having the growth team be separate from product, it was a whole separate organization, really for me was uncomfortable. I ended up having some unintended consequences. I mentioned how everyone wanted to be a manager. I had to pop that bubble. In some cases, to flatten the org, I actually took away people's direct reports because, and I had people quit because of that. So was it the right thing to do? I don't know. It's possible that I would have been better served by kind of compromising on some of those things.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Like, it's hard to kind of change a lot of company culture at once, or even in 6 months. And so the change of kind of like